Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of What the Forensics. I'm Rebecca, and I'm joined today by my co-hosts, Nicole and Journey. Today, we will be covering the case of Stephen Akinmurele, as told by Nicole, and fingerprinting, which was essential in his capture, which will be explained by Journey today. Before we begin, we just want to give a listener's discretion that there is going to be discussions of assault and suicide in today's episode. So without further ado, I can't wait to learn more about him because I'm very unfamiliar with this case. Nicole, why don't we get started?
Yeah, so his mother was from the Isle of Man in the United Kingdom, and his father was Nigerian. So Stephen Akinmurele was born in 1977 or 78, sources vary. And he was raised by his mother and grandmother by the time he was 6. So I guess his parents divorced before then, and at the time of 6, he moved to the Isle of Man with his mom and his grandmother, and his dad was kind of out of the picture. There's not much known that can be confirmed about his early life, but it was said that he got into fights at school, so had some mental health issues, as it said, apparently. And he was in and out of jail due to trouble he would get himself into. So this is kind of all that's known from his early life. He's not a very well-known serial killer or killer, I guess. When he turned 18, though, he moved off the island and he was working as a civil servant on the mainland. So this was now mainland, like United Kingdom, England. And he also worked as a barman at a local bar there. So getting into his murders, because his early life wasn't that interesting, it was said that a 75-year-old Jemima Cargill was suspected to have died in a house fire. And nothing really came about this at the time. It was just more of a mystery. It was an accidental fire. Then an elderly couple was found beaten to death. They were found by one of their daughters in October of 1988 in Blackpool, United Kingdom. And this was the same resort area where the house fire was that killed Jemima Cargill. So 77-year-old Eric Boardman, he was one of the victims along with his wife, Joan, who was 74. And at the crime scene, a bloodied homemade kosh, it's called, was found at the scene. So this is a thick or a heavy bat used to bludgeon to beat. And the kosh that Akinmurele used was made from batteries bound together. So a fingerprint was actually lifted from this because it was bloody enough to have a print. And this matched a print from Akinmurele. So after this murder, detectives learned that Akinmurele lived in the same resort and shared the flat with Cargill at the time. So Jemima was, I guess, Akinmurele's landlady. Like, I'm not really sure what the dynamic was there, but they lived in the same flat resort house type place. Once this came to light, that fire was deemed another murder committed by Akinmurele. And then in February 1996, 68-year-old Dorothy Harris was found dead in her home back on the Isle of Man. So this was back where he grew up, with her house also burnt down. Again, originally considered an accident, but it was soon to be deemed a homicide once light came about with Akinmurele. And it wasn't, yeah, and it wasn't, because so many accidents go about, houses burn down. They're like, it was an accident.
It's not entirely uncommon.
Just a common theme of elderly people dying in house fires. It makes sense. It's okay.
Yeah, none of them are directly connected to him anyways, so.
No, yeah, not at all. So it wasn't actually until they lifted his print that they started to connect the dots of previous deaths and his involvement. So there was another woman, Marjorie Ashton. She was strangled to death in 1995, and Akinmurele is suspected of being the offender, but not linked, apparently. And once again, all of this started to happen and points were starting to connect the dot kind of thing, the Isle of Man detectives began reopening cases dating back to 1994, to look at similarities that could link Akinmurele. So they saw a theme of elderly individuals dying in strange circumstances, no one being charged with whatever happened, and house fires.
So he's a suspect because of the fingerprint they found, right? It was only the fingerprint on the one crime scene, right?
Yeah, so just the
Okay.
one crime scene linked him to that one. And then detectives were just kind of like, oh, this seems fishy. This seems very similar. It's late 90s. They were just like, yeah, he's the guy.
All right, cool. I mean, not cool, but interesting.
Yeah. So he was arrested and charged with committing 4 homicides. So those of Jemima Cargill, Erica Joan Boardman, and Dorothy Harris. So the fingerprint left on the cosh was the primary evidence supporting his arrest, and not much else is known or like brought forward as evidence to link him to the crimes, I guess. And while he was being questioned, his demeanor was said to have changed very rapidly. So he'd be calm and polite 1 second, and then like flip of a switch, he would just be in a fit of rage that like scared detectives who were questioning him. One of the detectives actually said that he was, quote, one of the most dangerous men I have ever met, end quote.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's scary.
Yeah. And I'm not sure how many dangerous men this detective has seen, but as a detective, I would assume there'd be a few on that list.
Yeah, that's still quite the statement. Wow.
Yeah. So while he was in jail awaiting trial, he injured one of his doctors extremely badly and made threats to the others. And he also made a claim that he had killed another person that the police haven't found yet. But it turned out to be a false claim, or it wasn't true. Nothing came of it. So Akinmurele, unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess depends where you stand on this in his person. Akinmurele hung himself in his cell 3 weeks before his trial and was found on August 28th, 1999. Previous to this, he had tried to kill himself twice before, while his girlfriend had told the authorities that he was a danger to himself.
So maybe he should have been kept somewhere more secure.
But on top of that, so going to what you said, Rebecca, he was interviewed by several medical staff specialists, said he was haunted by the images of his victims, and he's actually moved to a healthcare ward after one of his attempted suicides. But he was moved back to a segregated unit because he made a weapon out of a toothbrush and talked about killing one of the female staff and taking her as hostage.
Oh.
Yeah. So he was separated, and then they said,
so they tried to help him out.
They tried. Yeah.
Okay.
So he was placed on suicide watch after this incident, but again, problems with the system, he still managed to kill himself only 2 days after that.
Wow.
Yeah, 2 days.
Okay, that's not great.
It was a great suicide watch. I assume it's a good record for that establishment.
Yep.
And chillingly, it was said that he left a note for his mother before he took his own life, saying, quote, I couldn't take any more of feeling like how I do now, always wanting to kill, end quote. I guess he just had a hatred to old people and just kept wanting to kill old people or just people regardless.
But why old people?
I don't know. There's nothing that I could find that like gave any mention or reason as to why. Like there's no family history. He was grown up with his grandmother and nothing was mentioned. Like maybe his grandmother was abusive. Nothing of that sort.
Maybe it was because he grew up with his grandmother. He's kind of like, okay, I don't like you anymore. I'm going to kill every old person that I come across. Seems a bit drastic.
I feel like it's very common for people to be grown up by their grandparents.
Yeah.
And the ratio to those killing old people and those not killing old people, like he could have done many different things other than what he did.
There are healthier coping mechanisms.
Yeah. Yes. Healthier coping mechanisms. And lastly, there was another note found in his pocket. So after he died and they took his body doing autopsies, whatever they were doing, this note said, quote, "I can't help the way I feel. What I did was wrong. I know that and I feel for them, but it doesn't mean I won't do it again. I'll keep on having this feeling I'm going mad because I can't take any more of this, and that's why I'm saying goodbye." End quote. So he knew what he did was awful, but he figured the easiest way out was to take his own life.
It's pretty sad, actually, that he's like, I feel really bad for what I'm doing, but I physically feel like I can't stop myself. Like,
Yeah.
it's sad that, like, obviously he was a bad person, but if he had psychological help, maybe this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. And I think like if I don't know what the prison systems are like in the UK, but like other prison systems are built and structured in a way to help individuals like that and like really focus on getting them back into society, whereas I know American prison systems and some other ones are just to detain and keep them locked up. So I feel like that could have been a reason why too. Like if the system like was like that, maybe he had no other option. It was either being locked up and getting into fights and possibly killing people or taking his own life, unfortunately.
Do you think, I just want to speculate, do you think he had dissociative identity disorder? And
Oh.
I think it's possible.
That's why he got into those like quick rages and why he's like, I feel so bad, but I can't stop
Yeah.
because
think that's
someone else is killing.
That's a good theory.
That kind of just popped into my head. I have absolutely no evidential basis for it.
We're not psychiatrists, but
it kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
It does.
While he was in prison, he was interviewed by like a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist, like all of these individuals. And yeah, they said that he was haunted by the images of his victims. So if that's the case, maybe Stephen hates what he had done, but then Stephen 2.0, maybe he's the one that's.
Or do you think, like, his haunting of the images of his victims, do you think he took on, like, their personalities? Because isn't it, like,
okay.
normally you, like, a
That would be
traumatic brings out, like, creates another personality. Do you think each of those traumatic events creates another personality that
Maybe that's why
then
he hates old
is
people.
haunting him?
Because
Yeah.
he's an old
like
person. He's
movie
creating
type shit
identities
right there.
that are old people. Oh my gosh. Okay,
Can
that's
you
too much.
imagine if he took on these people's personalities and he just starts like walking like an old person and he's like, "This is me now."
He sings. Old people talk. They just sing.
I guess so. That's just my view of every old person.
Every old person. At least they sing and they're not
They're all jolly. They're all jolly.
jolly. So that's all I've got for him. He is interesting, not as interesting as other people, but without that fingerprint, he may have never been caught. He may have started killing more old people.
Very true.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you, Nicole. That was very interesting. He definitely has more of an unknown history than some of the past killers that we've covered, but it's very interesting how instrumental One Fingerprint was for catching him. So, Journey, would you care to tell us a little bit more about fingerprinting?
You betcha. So, I'm going to talk about obviously fingerprints, how they connect to this case, and then I'm going to tell you a bit about like their background, how they came to be used in forensics, how fingerprint analysis and comparison works, and then we're going to discuss some of the issues with the discipline. And when I wrote this up, I kind of left a lot of room for discussion, so please feel free to jump in. Fingerprints obviously were the key evidence in this case, and unfortunately, he died before he went to trial. So we won't ever know if there's more evidence or the importance of the fingerprints that they found. So like Nicole said, his fingerprints were found on the kosh that he used to kill Eric Boardman, and the kosh is like a weapon used to bludgeon. And so it's theorized that because Eric Boardman fought back when he was being attacked, it was enough to like throw him off his game, and he ended up leaving the incriminating evidence at the scene. His MO is burning the place down after he kills people, but he didn't do that in this case, and like thankfully he didn't, otherwise he may never have been caught. So yeah, thankfully Eric Boardman fought back and he was able to leave his fingerprints and his weapon and everything at the scene of the crime. One that Nicole kind of mentioned, and in the source that I read, it said that he buried said person by a cliff, and then the police officers went and investigated and they found a gun with his fingerprints on it, but no body. And so no one knows why he confessed to this or like how true it actually is. And I'm really curious why the gun was there and why it had his fingerprints on it if it wasn't used to kill someone. Like he uses a kosh to like beat them and then burn their house down. He doesn't use guns.
Yeah,
Maybe
that's very confusing.
Maybe he just likes to carry them.
Maybe. I don't know.
It's just a threat.
Yeah,
I'm
so
gonna
they
use it,
like,
but I got it.
yeah, I have it. So yeah, anyway, they suspect that this story was just told to like mislead the cops and kind of just put them over there, even though he gave them evidence with his fingerprints on it. Anyway.
Wait, so nothing came from that gun? Like they found the gun and they were like, oh yeah, it's a gun with his prints, but we're not gonna try and link it to anything?
They couldn't find a body to link it to.
But could they have done like ballistics or anything of that? Well, I guess you couldn't do
but
it.
They didn't have anything to compare it to. Yeah. So they just have this gun.
Well, that's
rude. So sorry. Where was this gun found again?
By the cliff, right?
Cliff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Did they check off the cliff?
A random gun.
Yeah. He was just like, okay, so I killed and buried someone by this cliff. I can't remember what it was, or even if they gave me specifics. And they just went and they searched it and they found a gun and no body anywhere. And I don't know what was on the bottom of the cliff, if it was just like water or more land, but
interesting.
Very weird nonetheless.
Did you, in your source too, where Eric Boardman, when he fought back, one of the sources I heard that after his death, he was actually awarded with like a medal of bravery or something like that because of his fight back. Like he fought really hard back, and that's what allowed that fingerprint to catch him.
Yeah, no, I saw that too. I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah.
You go, Eric Boardman. You go.
Yeah. Thank you for helping us catch a serial killer. Okay, so yeah, fingerprints were used in this case. There was not a lot known with them because they never went to trial. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the background of fingerprinting. Fingerprints have been used since the 1850s, but in this case, it was more handprints that were used as a form of like signatures if you couldn't write. And it was actually William Herschel that came up with this idea, and he also monitored his fingerprints for 57 years and learned that they don't change as we get older, which is kind of interesting.
That's kind of a cool experiment.
Yeah.
That's a long one.
Like, was there a reason he did this, or was that out of pure interest? He's like, do these things change?
I think it was pure interest, to be honest with you. But anyway, super interesting and led to a lot of development in like the discipline of fingerprints.
So how, I know you said that they can use handprints as signatures. How would they confirm that that handprint was from someone? Would they like have them put their hand over top? Would they do a print beside it? Because I would assume most handprints look similar.
Honestly, I have no idea.
Maybe it's just the size of the hand. I don't know. I'm just going on a tangent.
People have the same, like I assume the three of us have very similar sized hands.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just like the different like crease placements or scars. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they ever just like verified it. I think they were just like, okay, handprint, boom, this has been signed.
I feel like it was probably similar to like how we use signatures now. It's like we have to sign so much, but is someone actually sitting behind a desk and going, okay, this matches the signature that she gave us last year, so we can confirm it's her? Or do you think it's just like, oh, you're here in person and don't know how to write your name? Great, just give us your hand.
Yeah, I think that was it.
Okay, another question. What if you had no hands? Do you do you have to use like footprints? Like, are you going around stamping documents with your feet?
I was just gonna be
Probably.
mean and say they're just using their nub,
They're
but
I mean, it is a very, very distinct signature at that point.
That's true. That's true. Because technically they can't write, but maybe like someone else like signed for it on behalf of the person who has no hands. Or
there's
else
just
they
so
use
many
footprints. I'm not
questions
sure.
about how
Yeah,
they
and
use signatures in the 1850s.
and I have no answers.
Because I guess there's also the question of how many people in the 1850s were alive with no hands. Like, were they born that way? Because I assume there's too much infection and risk of cutting them off.
Oh yeah, maybe they didn't live past that. Anyways, aside from this little no hands tangent we went on, what was the next development in said science journey?
Okay, so in 1891, Juan Vustiche, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, came up with the first fingerprint classification system, which was basically the Bertillon system with fingerprints. And so the Bertillon system is a system of like anthropometry where 11 body measurements are taken as well as a mugshot, and that's used to basically individualize and identify suspects. Obviously, there's a lot of issues with that, but we're not going to get into that. And then in 1897, Edward Henry proposed what is now the basis for classification that we have right now. And then the actual use of fingerprinting in forensic cases was developed by Sir Francis Galton in 1901 after the Will West case. And so, the Will West case. In 1903, Will West went to turn himself in for a minor crime, or he went to the local penitentiary. I don't know if he was arrested or not. And when they pulled what they thought was his Bertillon system card, they found that a William West was already there serving a crime for first-degree murder. And the pictures of them look identical. Like they look so similar. They have the same name, so it's not surprising that they got mixed up. But still, it's not that reliable and probably wouldn't have happened if fingerprints were on file, which is kind of what Sir Francis Galton was like, hey, maybe have a more reliable method of identifying people.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the chances though? Like, say we were still on this system, these system cards.
Yeah.
If you were to be like, hey, like I kind of hit someone with my car, I'm turning myself in. If someone were to check your card and be like, oh, there's another Journey or another Rebecca, like serving time, you're free to go. Or do they both go in? Do they like?
Well, because it was different crimes, they kind of had to do like extra research and be like, hey, this is weird. There's two people with exactly the same names and faces in this penitentiary, but like we maybe need to update our system.
Do you think there's another Rebecca, Journey, or Nicole that looks identical to us?
Apparently, everybody has at least 7 doppelgangers, or like 7 people that look like us on the earth.
But what about names though? Because the chances of them being in the same area with the same name of Will West or William West, looking the exact same, both
I feel like
committing
that's
crimes.
pretty unlikely.
Is it a conspiracy theory? Is this something the government? Is this why fingerprints started? All because of the conspiracy theory?
Oh my goodness.
We're going down some rabbit holes today.
So anyway, what are fingerprints? So fingerprints are made of, they're just friction ridges on our hands and feet, and they are formed in utero by the amniotic fluid, which is why everyone's are different, because everyone obviously moves differently in the womb. And I thought that was so cool, because I had no idea that your fingerprints were formed in utero. Like, that's very interesting to me. And so by the time a fetus is 6 months old, their fingerprints are actually fully formed, and they will never change until they die.
I think that's crazy that we literally only have these for friction.
Yeah.
Like, it's like to grab stuff, and we get wrinkly in water because friction. Like, we get wrinkly and pruny because it increases our friction underwater. I think that's crazy.
Right?
So if these are developed in utero, with twins or triplets, however many lits you have, how different would their fingerprints be? Because I know that they're all still moving differently in utero, but would they share some similarities or none at all?
I think they're still quite different, because they're still moving different, and like, it's fluid, so it's changing. I think they're still fairly different. I can't remember, because I was looking back at our lectures from this, and I know that we had talked about it, but I didn't have any notes on it.
Because I know that they're not identical.
Yeah.
I know that they aren't. I'm just curious as to how similar they would be.
I had no idea that monozygotic twins didn't share fingerprints.
Mm-hmm.
My mind is blown.
Yeah. They are different. But with that, no. I'm thinking of a case where one twin was convicted of something, but it happened to be the other twin, and they used some evidence, but now that I think about it, I think it was like DNA, not fingerprints. So that was kind of...
if they're identical twins, they have like identical DNA.
Okay,
according to Washington State, even though fingerprints of the identical twins are very similar, they're not identical. Okay. So apparently they are quite similar, but there's differences.
Interesting. All right. So, like Rebecca said, these friction ridges allow us to like hold things and be identified when we commit a crime. So, it's our pores in the middle of these ridges that makes the fingerprint. So it's like the sweat and the oils coming from these pores that's on the surface that we collect the fingerprint from, which is both interesting and really gross. And in order to change your fingerprints, you have to damage past your dermal papillae in order to leave a scar. And so there's like 3 layers. You have the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis of your skin. And so the epidermis has your 7 layers of skin. It's the topmost layer. And then you have the dermis underneath it, and then the hypodermis underneath the dermis. And so you'd have to damage or like get rid of your entire epidermis or like top layer of your skin in order to remove your fingerprints.
So you need to badly burn it.
So cut your finger off. Just cut it off, essentially.
Just cut your fingers off. Great.
But then if you commit a crime and you're like, okay, this person's fingers are like really short, they're obviously missing the tips of their fingers. That's very identifiable.
Well, what was the mobster's name who tried burning his fingertips off with acid, and then obviously his fingerprints had scar marks on it, and they could be identified as him?
Yeah, he was still identifiable, because how many people don't have fingerprints on their fingers?
Exactly. It was John Dillinger.
Okay,
he was an acid bath murderer, I think. Wasn't he?
Yeah.
I think so.
Anyway, he did that, and it's still obviously very identifiable. So the whole reason we start looking at fingerprints is the idea that no 2 fingerprints have been found to have the same characteristics. And so, of course, there's been no research to prove this, because not everyone's going to be like, okay, you can have my fingerprints to compare for science to see if everyone has the same fingerprints or not. So we're kind of just going off of the fingerprints that we've collected and people working in like government agencies where you're required to have your fingerprints. And another thing with that is how many characteristics have to match in order for fingerprints to be the same. And so there's a whole bunch of questions with this, which I'll get into later. Now I'm going to talk about how prints are collected. And so fingerprints can be collected from virtually any surface. However, the smoother the surface, the better. I found that when we were taking fingerprints in our lab, you could not take a fingerprint from a piece of wood. It was so difficult. And I don't know if my fingerprints were, yeah, right? I don't know if my hands weren't sweaty enough, but I could not find a fingerprint on that thing for the life of me.
I think it was a mix of like the striations in the wood plus like how porous it is. So it just friggin' absorbs all the oil from our hands. That was my guess.
Let me tell
Obviously,
you.
I don't know.
I have the sweatiest hands ever, and I could not get a print off of wood. No matter the type of wood, no matter if it was like, what is it, pressed or like untreated.
Cured.
Yeah, no print. You just get the wood markings. Maybe like the outline at the top of your finger, but that was it.
I mean, maybe it's just because we didn't have the right techniques because we're students, but it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard.
So moral of the story, use wood as weapons.
I was going to be like, well, take this information how you want, but we're not saying to use this method.
Anyway, don't kill people. That's bad. So when crime scene investigators suspect there's a print somewhere, they have a plethora of powders and chemicals to collect it. And in class, we got to use black powders, magnetic, not like explosive black powders, just actual black powder, magnetic powders, fluorescent powders, and white powders. And then, so each of these powders is useful on different surfaces. So for example, if you have a fingerprint on a black car, using white powder instead of the black powder will make it easily visible to the naked eye. And then you can use either clear tape or the fancy lifting tape stuff that you can get to lift the print. Is really cool. It has like, the paper is like pre-attached to the tape. I don't know how to explain it, and I can't remember the name of it.
So I've got, I think it's your thumbprint journey on that lifting tape. I'll put it in our source images just so you can see, because it's like a square of paper that you peel the tape off, lift it, and then you like fold it back down onto the paper.
Yeah, it's just easier than lifting it with tape and then putting it onto a different piece of paper. It's just all in. And then with fluorescent powders, you can only take a picture of the print because it's difficult to actually lift the print because you need it to fluoresce in order to see it. So you don't really like know where it is until you shine the flashlight on it, get it to fluoresce, and then you take a picture of it, and then you analyze it that way. And the coolest lifting technique is the cyanoacrylate technique, or which is super glue. And so with this one, you just basically fumigate your fingerprint with gaseous super glue, and then it sticks to the fingerprints, and the kind of reaction between the super glue and the sweat that is making the fingerprints creates a white powder that sticks to the friction ridges that have been left on that surface, which is really, really cool. And so we also got to do that.
Wasn't it like the sweatier the print, the more noticeable it was?
Yeah, it was like the more oily sort of thing.
Which it was cool. We got to do that in class. And it kind of worked, but it kind of also didn't.
Well, we didn't have the proper, like we did it in what, 2 days? Like it didn't have the proper chamber. We literally put in like a plastic Tupperware with the tinfoil and the fumes. Yeah. I'm sure there's other ways, better ways to do that.
There definitely is, but hey, it was really neat to experience. Now we have our fingerprints, but how do we compare them? So the most common technique is the ACE-V system to analyze prints, and ACE-V stands for analysis, which obviously you assess the quality and quantity of detail of your lifted fingerprint, and then you compare them. So you have a side-by-side comparison between the question print and the lifted print. So you compare the suspect to, if you have a suspect, to the print that you took from the scene. And in Canada, when we're analyzing prints, we go from ridge to ridge. and compare landmark to landmark, starting from the core, which is the very middle of your print, and then working outwards. I'll talk about this a bit more later on. And then you evaluate it, which is exactly what it sounds like. You decide if the print is inconclusive, so there's not enough information known about this print to match it. You can exclude it, so it's obviously not this person, it doesn't match at all, or it's an individualization, it does match this print. Then we have verification, which is getting a second opinion on your conclusion. And this is where we're finding a lot of issues right now, because a lot of people don't agree with others' conclusions. And so even if you show the same prints to the same examiner, they won't always come to the same conclusion, which is a massive, massive issue in forensic science when everything needs to be repeatable and reliable and like the same, because you don't want to give a print to someone and they're like, okay, yeah, this is Rebecca. And then you give it to someone else like, okay, no, this is Nicole. And then you give it back to the person who said it was Rebecca, and they're like, no, this is actually Journey. And you're like, okay, please, can you make up your mind? Like, this is someone's life we're kind of talking about here. Anyway,
it's unfortunately very subjective.
Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for, subjective. And so when we're analyzing fingerprints, we look at 3 different levels of characteristics. And so the first level is patterns, and a lot of prints share these patterns, so you can't identify or individualize with just the level 1 characteristics. And so the main 3 patterns are loops, whorls, and arches. I'm going to post pictures of each of these so you guys know what we're talking about. But they look exactly how you'd think they look. And arches are the rarest type of pattern, with only 5% of people having them. And I'm actually part of the 5%, not to brag.
Wow.
I know I have a tented arch, which is like the most rare. Only one though, but that's okay. And so you can have a plain arch, a tented arch, right and left loops, central pocket loops, and double loops. So there's different variations of these 3, but they're still not enough to individualize because there's only 3 that you share. And then level 2 is Minutiae. And so this is the ridge characteristics that make fingerprints unique. So like the number of ridges, the type, the location of certain characteristics, such as bifurcations, which is splitting of the ridges, so they kind of like fork off. And then enclosures, which are pretty much just like bubbles. Well, not really bubbles.
So it's like one line forks off, but then reconnects into one line.
Yes, thank you. And then cores, which is like the middle of the print, so that's how you know kind of where to start. Ridge endings, exactly what they sound like. Deltas are little triangles that are very important characteristics of whorls and of loops. You cannot classify something as a whorl or a loop without a delta. And so it's the most kind of important. It's just a little triangle off to the side. You could probably find it. It's very interesting. And then islands and dots are just little dots of ridges that vary in length. So islands are a bit bigger than dots, obviously. And then you have the short ridges, which again, exactly what they sound like. And then you can individualize with level 2 characteristics. However, there is a dispute right now over how many of these characteristics are needed to make a match. Again, I talk about that a bit later on. And then lastly, we have level 3, which is pores and ridges. So this is things like ridge shapes, thickness, finger creases, and incipient ridges, which are thin ridges that lack pores. This is really interesting because you can clearly see creases on your prints, which is very, very cool. And creases can also be used to identify fingerprints or identify people, because everyone has creases in different spots, but it's very, again, quite difficult because there's no real standard to it.
Journey, you have very creasy thumbs, don't you?
Yes.
If I remember correctly.
I sure do. Look.
If I know you guys obviously can't see us, but we're on Microsoft Teams, and all three of us are just staring at our fingers right now, trying to go through and see what we've got.
Right. I'll be like holding my boyfriend's hand. I'll like grab his hand and be like examining his fingerprints. Like,
I do the
"Ooh,
same
look, a
thing.
bifurcation."
I look and I'm like, look, you have 2 deltas.
Yeah. He's
They're
like,
probably
that's
like,
really
what the hell are you talking
Yeah.
about?
At this point, he's very used to it, and it's okay. Anyway, so as you guys may have guessed, we got to take and analyze our own fingerprints in our forensics course, and it was so cool and so hard. I am so bad at rolling my own fingerprints, and I
Me
have
too.
just like a sheet of paper in my bedroom of my attempts.
Yep.
Anyway, yeah. And then we had to take home our fingerprints and analyze them. And let me tell you, that was so difficult without a magnifying glass.
I thought that fingerprinting would be super like, I say it is interesting, but I thought it was going to be like super like cool and interesting, and it was going to be so exciting. And then I got onto my computer to analyze them, and I was just like, my eyes were burning
Oh
trying
my
to
goodness.
find little individual characteristics from a black and white print.
Right? And we took like good prints. Like usually in a crime scene, the prints are not as good as what we took. And so to try and match these fingerprints, oh my goodness, it would have been awful.
Well, because like for us, we were going through and like actively rolling left to right, putting even pressure, whereas in crime scene cases, like if I'm robbing someone, I'm not just gonna be like, oh, let me grab this, roll my thumb, okay, and now I'm going. Like you grab it, go. You're not like, it's not a
Yeah.
perfect print.
Yeah, exactly. And then, yeah, because we didn't have magnifying glasses, I just took a picture of my prints and like put it on my computer and just zoomed in. I was like, yeah, science. It was so difficult. And so, now I'm going to talk a bit about AFIS. And so AFIS stands for the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, which is our database where all our fingerprints are held. And so you submit your print to AFIS, and then it gives you like X amount of possible matches back. And then a human examiner has to go through each of these possible matches and compare them to the suspects, or no, the lifted print from the crime scene to determine whether or not they are matches. And it saves so much time because the examiner doesn't have to go through and decide which fingerprints are potential matches and then figure out if they are matches. Like it makes it a lot easier for the examiners, which is kind of nice. Fingerprints have come under a bit of scrutiny since the Brandon Mayfield case, where his fingerprints were misidentified as matching the ones found on the bomb shrapnel from the 2004 Madrid bombings. And so right now, the main issue with fingerprint examination is that it's highly subjective and different examiners may come to different conclusions, which you don't want, and which we kind of touched on already. And there's no standard number of characteristics that constitute a match. So some countries use 6. You only need 6 matching characteristics in a fingerprint, and some use 16. So there's quite a difference with that. And forensic scientists right now are really pushing to kind of learn how true the statement of no 2 fingerprints are the same. They kind of want to figure out how accurate is that? How many people have the potential to have similar fingerprints? And they just want to make it as reliable as possible. Of course, it's nowhere near as unreliable as other disciplines like bite mark analysis, but it can still be improved, which is kind of what we're pushing for.
Don't get me started on bite mark analysis.
Yeah, that is a rant for another day.
Yep.
And that is the end of my TED Talk.
Nice. And going back to like the shapes of fingerprints, it starts in the center, right? So your core determines if you have a whorl, a loop, or an arch.
Yes,
right?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so if you aren't able to look on our webpage at the images that Journey has provided, an arch, as it sounds like, it goes from the left side up, kind of like a hill, down to the right. A loop. What does a loop look like? Let me reference this.
A loop is just the same. It can go from the left, it kind of goes up, and then it loops back down and goes back out the left, or it can come from the right, go up, and then loop around and come back out the right.
Right. So with the loop, that's where Journey, when she mentioned the deltas, you have one delta in a loop and then two in a whirl. So a whirl, like, is basically just a...
It's like a spiral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you'll see those little like delta ridges on the left and the right side where it's kind of like a triangle. If you look at your fingerprints and you have whorls, it joins in like 3 different directions.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Journey, for that very interesting talk on fingerprints. We learned a lot, and we hope that you did too. It really taught us a lot about how Akinmure's prints were used to catch him. And now I believe Nicole has a current event to share with us, as we sometimes share current events in forensic science that have been happening.
I was looking on the news and I found an article saying that Dorset police, so in the United Kingdom, they're going to become the first ones in the country to use new technologies to allow crime scene investigators to transfer fingerprints from crime scenes to the Fingerprint Bureau, like right then and there. So this can achieve identification in minutes to hours rather than days to weeks. So if they've got a fingerprint, I don't know the technology because it's fairly new, but I guess it scans it. They transfer it onto some sort of screen that gets automatically transferred to whatever database they have. So if it's APHIS or any of that, and then they can get a match or a hit, however you want to call it, fairly quickly.
That's crazy.
Really cool.
So I don't know what the limitations are going to be with this, because I could assume that there's going to be some problems trying to scan it, because I know my printer scanner is not the best, especially with fine details. So unless they've got, well, probably I assume they have a huge budget, but they'll need the best of the best for scanners.
Do you think that they're kind of like, do you think they'd have to use the powder to make the print visible? And then do you think they'd like 3D scan it, or like use the 3D scanner? Because they're using 3D scanners right now. Or I read a paper about using 3D scanners to analyze footwear impressions. So I don't know if that's the
I
same
heard about
kind of
that.
thing.
Maybe if they used powder, there'd be limitations in the sense that they couldn't use fluorescence powders. And I assume they could use chemicals, but typically that's done back in the lab.
Yeah.
So I guess it'll depend on how good the print is, but I'm curious to see what comes of it. Because like this article I found, it was published October 26th of this year. So it hasn't even been a month.
Wow, so very recent.
Wow.
So it's very recent, yeah.
That's really cool.
So hopefully in the coming weeks and months, we'll hear more about it and its successes or its limitations.
Yeah.
And I just remembered a really fun fact about fingerprinting is you can actually transfer DNA from one fingerprint to another via the fingerprint brush, which is a massive source of contamination. So you can be like fingerprinting like suspect 1 or like fingerprint 1, like dust it with a little brush, and then you go to the other fingerprint to dust, and you bring DNA from the first fingerprint to the second set of fingerprints.
Yeah, for listeners that don't know the brush that we're talking about too, it's like this really light, feathery brush, I guess. Like there's a couple of different ones. You put a little powder on it, and then you see, as in like CSI or whatever, they do the little spinny with their fingers or their hands. They get the powder on it, and that's
you're just like lightly
visible.
brushing it.
Yeah. That's crazy, because I know you can get touch DNA, like secondhand transfer, say I like shook your hand, my DNA could be found on your body.
Like
but
trace evidence.
Yeah, I didn't realize, because there's not a lot of DNA in touch evidence at all.
No, but there's just enough
crazy.
to contaminate it and completely throw off your DNA results.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
So they're
But
trying
how many scientists are using fingerprints for DNA though?
They're not. It's just like the surface.
Oh, okay.
Like,
so if they do a swab
like,
close by, nearby after.
Yeah, it can like change it. And like none of the fingerprint techniques destroy the DNA that's there.
Okay.
Which is very interesting and cool as well. Anyway, yeah.
Interesting. Well, thank you, Nicole, for that current events topic. Hopefully we hear more about it in the future and see if it was a success or not. Now we will be drawing our random number generator, just like we do every episode, to be figuring out what our discussions will be on next week. So, Journey, would you care to pick a random number from our generator?
Handy dandy Google 1 to 150.
Come here, Mr. Google. He gave me 116.
So, The Big Book of Serial Killers by Jack Rosewood, which I severely recommend. That gives us Diego Henrique Gomez da Rocha. We'll work on the pronunciation again. The last two have been a little brutal. Our apologies, but with a brief look, this case, although he wasn't caught because of ballistics, some of the evidence from a scene was matched to him that way through ballistics, I think. They did some testing. But we will have more about that 2 weeks from now. This is fairly new too, just quickly looking at the book. He was arrested in 2014. He was sentenced, well, I guess we'll learn more about it, but he was sentenced to 564 years.
Oh,
that's
enough.
That's rough. Okay, well, I can't wait to discuss Tiago in our next episode and ballistics. Would one of you care to tell the audience where they can find us on social?
Sure. Our beautiful listeners can find us on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook at What the Forensics, as well as our website, which is whattheforensics.ca. There on our website, you can find source material, source images, a little bit about us, and our episodes are actually on our page as well. Our Twitter is WT Forensics PC. Journey, what's our email if people want to get a hold of us?
Our email is whattheforensics@gmail.com.
This has been another episode of What the Forensics. We are your hosts, Rebecca, Nicole, and Journey. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and we can't wait to share another episode in a couple of weeks.
Just a reminder to everyone that we are not professionals in the forensic science field. We are just students who are learning and want to share what we are learning with our listeners. We're trying to give you the most accurate information, but we are human and we can make mistakes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you next week.